Okay. Welcome, everybody. I'm Eli Sagor with the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative, broadcasting today from the Cloquet Forestry Center. We're glad to have you all here. This is going to be a fun webinar, I think. It's a little bit different format from what we normally do. We have two speakers. Bob Hyde from the Michigan Department of Natural Resources will talk a little bit about emerald ash borer impacts on Michigan forests and how it's been managed there. And then we'll have Andrew Arends from the DNR here in Minnesota talking a little bit about plans. There's been very little, if any, impact on woodlands here in Minnesota yet, but EAB is here, and we'll see those impacts soon. So we'll hear both of those perspectives, which I think should be interesting. A quick reminder that if you have questions, and I suspect there may be a fair number today, please use the chat pod to submit those. Make sure you send those to all participants, or I think it's all attendees. I'm sorry, no, not all attendees, but use all participants. Don't send them to Andrew or Bob. I've told them they don't need to watch the chat pod. They can focus on their remarks. So again, submit questions anytime to all participants. Those of you here in the room, just let me know you got a question and we'll share it. We will have Bob Hyde start off. Bob's going to talk for 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll take a couple of questions after his remarks. Then we'll go to Andrew, and at the end we should have plenty of time for additional Q&A for either speaker or both. So I hope everyone is hearing us and seeing us okay. Again, any questions, use the chat pod. We'll reply as quickly as we can. And with that, I'm going to welcome and introduce our first speaker. As I said, his name is Bob Hyde. Bob is a forest health specialist with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, and he's here with us today to share the Michigan perspective on emerald ash borer and how it's impacted their forests. Bob, you're on.
Was trained. All right. Well, it all started in Michigan, so I guess it makes sense to have someone from Michigan give you a perspective on what you might have in your future in terms of your ash species there. It started here in 2002 when we picked it up in southeastern Michigan and soon thereafter in southwest Ontario. And so in the last 14 years, you've seen the number of states and the degree of spread this has had. It's been pretty amazing. Our experience in Michigan is going to be significantly different than yours for a number of reasons. I throw this on as a generalized map developed by the Forest Inventory Analysis Group. And again, this map doesn't focus on urban resources, city trees, that sort of thing. This is a forest inventory. And you can see we have almost 1 billion ash trees, bigger than an inch diameter, 171 5 inches and larger, 51 million ash in a 9-inch and larger diameter. That's when this whole thing started. The advantage Michigan has that Minnesota won't have is that you can see that a majority of our resource is in white and green ash. 1.7 million cords versus 250,000 cords in black ash, whereas, of course, Minnesota has predominantly black ash. This has helped us in dealing with the problem, at least to the fact that we have markets for green and white ash that are much stronger than markets for black ash. And, of course, black ash are in lowland, wetland areas where accessibility and BMPs and such make a big difference. But in either case, you're looking at 6% of our hardwood volume, which is a significant amount of ash. I threw the quarantine map up simply it's an interesting thing to look at. So we only have, since 2002, and a few years after that we started setting quarantines, there's only 3 counties in the uppermost of Michigan, Upper Peninsula of Michigan, the west side, that we haven't quarantined now due to the presence of emerald ash borer. And the interesting thing is that as we talk about spread rates, the spread rates in Michigan won't reflect necessarily yours, because when we first picked this up, it had been here for 10 or 15 years in this part of Michigan, in the southeast part of Michigan. And at that time, there was no knowledge. They didn't realize if you moved one piece of firewood, you could move a population of emerald ash borer and infest an entirely new area. And in fact, in 2002, when we picked it up here, down in very southeastern parts of Michigan. It was already up here north of Houghton, north of Michigan Tech University, in a place called Lorium, because it had been moved up there in firewood. So we had a difficult time knowing just exactly where it was. Your advantage will be that now that we are understanding firewood and the potential for it to move not just emerald ash borer but other things around, you'll do a better job of keeping this long distance spread in check. Although I'll have to say, you'll do a better job, but it's a daunting task, because there are still people in Michigan, particularly in the Upper Peninsula, that still have never heard of emerald ash borer, as difficult as that is to believe for people that work in the industry. This is a map that we put together. It shows the current mortality of ash from emerald ash borer from inventory between 2009 and 2013. You can see now that instead of having 171 million ash greater than 5 inches, they're saying 148. Their estimate at this point, and this it's still early, is 31 million in the forest standing dead ash, which is, again, just an estimate, and they're estimating that we're losing about 6 million ash that are 5 inches and larger in diameter, breast height, annually. And if you look at the map, you'll see, of course, in the red area, that's where we lost greater than 75% of all ash species, and the lighter colors somewhat less than that. But you'll notice a good deal of lower Michigan has a lot of it that we've lost at least half the ash. And if you would drive from Mackinac Bridge on 75 all the way down through southern Ohio, as far as you can see, you'll see dead ash on both sides of the road. Let's go back up here just for a second. Okay, no, let's go the other way. Okay, so the eastern UP, fortunately, doesn't have a lot of ash species. So as it moves to the west, we'll find there's much more ash, and the problems will be significant. But backing up a little bit, let's talk about, it's important to be able to detect emerald ash borer as it enters an area for the first time in order to have some idea what you need to do in terms of responding to it. How urgent is it that you get in your woodlot and harvest ash species before the emerald ash borer takes them, if you want to get value out of those trees? Or how urgent is it that you start spraying trees in a landscape environment, in an urban setting, with some of the available materials to protect against it? You don't want to do it too early, yet you don't want to do it too late. Well, that's one of the inherent problems that you'll find with emerald ash borer. It's extremely difficult to detect. A lot of times you're looking for these little D-shaped exit holes in the tree, which is diagnostic for emerald ash borer in ash species. Most of the time what we do anymore, you can't really go out to all the trees and look for these little exit holes in declining trees, because there are things other than emerald ash borer that cause decline, particularly in black ash, which is another unique problem you'll see. We've had a lot of declines in ash species before emerald ash borer ever hit. And so just to go out and look at declining trees and trying to determine if it's EAB or not is a daunting task. So generally, what we do anymore in the state is we look for trees like this one you see in the lower right-hand corner, where woodpeckers have come in and they know emerald ash borer is there. They detect the larvae, the adults are emerging, and they'll start knocking the bark off, what they call scaling the tree. And we start seeing the scaling, we know that woodlot or that area is now involved in emerald ash borer. And we'll go to confirm it. We'll go and find the galleries under the bark or the D-shaped exit holes. So initially, this is Pete Davis up here in the right-hand corner. We really wanted to bird dog this thing as closely as we could. If you really don't want to know if you have emerald ash borer, what you do is you go in and you girdle a tree, like you see the girdle there, and then come back that summer or the following year, actually cut the tree down, strip all of its bark off. You'll see the galleries, and you know if you have EAB or you know if you don't have it. So you feel pretty comfortable when you do this if you don't have it in an area. So if you don't find it in these what are called trap trees, and you're pretty confident you don't have emerald ash borer in the area. However, that's an extremely expensive, and now that we're in the phase of this where it's moving in large volumes throughout areas, we really don't have the resources to put out trap trees anymore. So they've gone to the next best thing, which are these triangular traps, which are purple or green in color. You'll see them along roads that are baited with some materials that attract the EAB to the traps, and they stick to the traps. The problem with this is that once you find them in these triangular traps, then the population has probably been there for maybe 5 or 6 years. It's not a real sensitive tool, but it does tell you if there's some in the area. So our real daunting task here is to know when EAB enters an area. Once it does enter an area, then you've got a limited amount of time before those populations build up, and you have opportunities to either protect them in an urban landscape or to go in and start looking at your woodlots that have an ash component and deciding whether you want to salvage that ash or how you respond to it. Early in the infestation, if you have a vigorous ash resource, the emerald ash borer tends to reinfest the same tree over and over again, so it doesn't move very fast. So it only moves from about a quarter to a half mile a year. And in the north part of Minnesota and the north part of Michigan, they're also on a 2-year life cycle. However, once the emerald ash borer gets a foothold and starts causing its stress in trees, or if you have a stress resource, that will move to a 1-year life cycle, which is actually a tremendous difference in population potential. And once these populations start building up and go to a 1-year life cycle, then they're moving much more quickly through the landscape from 3/4 of a mile to a mile a year, and ash mortality progresses much more quickly. Let's see. So our initial guidance was, okay, let's find out where it is. So we put the trap trees out. We would find out, okay, we have a population. Like you see this map here, we found a population. And so we said, if we go out 10 miles, that's how long it's going to take 5 to 10 years to move that far. Okay, so we need to focus our activity within this zone, this treatment zone, because we know we have ash borer here. We don't seem to have it out here. On state land, we generated these maps to show us where the ash resources were. Private lands, we didn't have those resources, but we put out information. If you're within this zone, there's a good chance within the next 10 years you'll see ash mortality in your area. So that was a valuable service. The difficulty now is we don't have trap trees anymore. We can still do that with the detection surveys we do with the triangle traps, but we have the other problem in that we still have the wild card there, and that is we don't know what people are doing in terms of ash trees as they die, in terms of moving it around as firewood. So this is just our best estimate of how long you might have before you have to respond to it. So basically our silvicultural guidelines still is, because we have foresters out looking, if we don't see if we don't see the woodpecker scaling trees and such, and there's nothing within 10 or 15 miles, we think, well, we've got probably 10 years. That's a kind of important date for a lot of higher quality hardwoods, because that means you may have time to go in twice and remove some material. So you'll go in, maybe you can take out a part of your ash component now, wait for 10 years, EAB may be showing up at that time, and do a second harvest, which gives your stand time to respond to it and gives you time perhaps to recruit other tree species other than ash and do some silvicultural management, so that when it does come, you're not having to take all the ash out all at once. So basically your objective is to create a stand that will maintain a minimum basal area in the event that all ash is eventually lost to EAB. That's if you have time. If you have a tremendous advantage now that we have in the western UP and Minnesota, is you have time now, if you don't have EAB in your neighborhood, to go in there and do proactive management. Don't wait until the last minute to start reducing the amount of ash that you have in your stand. Although I have to say with black ash, that's going to be more challenging in terms of restoration, because what will your options be? So basically, if you can, you try to leave the large, this is white and green ash. Pole-sized trees, take your large trees, because moving large trees, you have a tremendous greater amount of population potential buildup. So if you have to go and thin trees out, leave the smaller ones, the ones that still could grow for 10 years and produce product, but take the larger ones out that will produce more adults per square foot of surface area. So basically, you want to create a more diverse forest resource that's resistant to catastrophic changes affecting a single species or genera. So as you look at this, what we're trying to do is increase species diversity, basically. But we're really not trying to eliminate all the ash from all the forest stands. The unfortunate part is you'll probably end up, particularly in your higher stock stand, particularly with black ash, understocking, conversion to perhaps undesirable species like alder and in our case striped maple and other things like that. So it's a real challenge to us what to do in terms of restoration. So it's leading us into probably considering much more than we ever had before the use of herbicides and actually going in and perhaps doing some planting on some of these sites. Good news is EAB does little to degrade ash wood products, so that even when it starts hitting, it only affects those outer rings, so you still have a viable product until the ash is dead. The other important note is if you should start monitoring your ash resources now, particularly because of the firewood movement. And because it is a sun-loving beetle, and this is again more true in areas where you have mixed hardwoods with it, they'll hit the edge trees first, the trees that are fully exposed to the sun, you'll start seeing impact there first. But once you start seeing impact and you pick up EAB, the rest of it can happen very quickly. Again, I'm not sure if I mentioned this, but I'll mention it again. Black ash and green ash are the most vulnerable, and again, you have mostly black ash, so your resource is extremely vulnerable. We do have some resistance in white ash that we're finding in southern Michigan, which is good news. But basically, it's not much of the ash is surviving. We're seeing 75 to 95% of the ash, all species, being removed from the landscape. And again, remember, once this starts happening, buildup is going to happen quicker because you'll move. If you are at a 2-year life cycle in the north, you'll move to a 1 year, and things are going to happen very quickly. And the last and positive note, because I believe my time is close to running out, is we're doing a lot with releasing these parasites under the direction of the Forest Service and universities. And I suggest that as you get into the throes, I know you have a few areas now, and I'm sure you are introducing these parasites. And that's really our long-term hope for mediation of this problem, is that these parasites over a long period of time become part of the part of the system that limits the growth of emerald ash borer. That and resistance. Don't have time to talk about resistance, but there is some positive information on the horizon. So we'll continue to work with that. And at that, Eli, I believe I've run out of time.
Good overview. I see one question in the chat pod, bit of a devil's advocate question. Why not remove all ash from susceptible sites?
That's true. Why not remove all ash? I suppose it's interesting, in southern Michigan, when we lose the black and green ash, we're finding that when the white ash is there all by itself, that they seem to do better. The populations don't build up as quickly if you can keep it vigorous, and we are actually finding a number of those trees are resistant. So one reason why not remove all the ash was if there is resistance, we want to be able to take that and start looking at that genetically in terms of crosses and dealing with that genetics. The other thing is it's still a unique species. We don't lose 100% of it, and so we keep it in the landscape in case EAB does succumb eventually to some of this biocontrol. We do have some other options, and in most of the case with our mixed, maybe not so much true for black ash, but in terms of upland ashes, if you leave it as a component, if you do lose, say, less than 10 square feet, scattering here and there, it doesn't really affect the production of the forest that much, but yet you're still enhancing the biodiversity and keeping the species around a little bit longer instead of yourself eliminating ash from the landscape. So we don't see it as a great economic impact. I guess the other answer I'll give to that is we have probably 500,000 acres just on state forest land that have an ash component. As we look at this and try to salvage it, we actually find that we actually had salvageable amounts in terms of access and value only on about 60 or 70,000 of those acres. So ash is a minor component of a lot of different kinds of stands, and we're just not really going to be able to go out there and get it all anyway. So leaving a component there is just what's happening. Most of the time not realistic to try to go in there and get it out. It's not economical.
Bob, you have touched on something that I think might be of interest to a lot of people. I know my ears perked up a little bit when you talked about resistance and less than 100% mortality. And we sometimes hear some pretty dire predictions of nearly 100% mortality. It's probably something that would take a while to go into in depth, but can you say any more about that resistance, where you're seeing it, and anything about the pattern or level of resistance based on your observations?
Well, my understanding is primarily white ash, a little bit of green ash, and they're calling it lingering ash down in northern Ohio and southern Michigan. They're studying it out of Ohio State University, Michigan State University, Michigan Tech University. Those number of people are involved in looking at it, the Northern Research Station of the U.S. Forest Service, and they're very interested. They're very intrigued. They're finding that some of, particularly like the white ash, will be attacked, but then it calluses and it's not killing the trees. So there is definitely some issue here in terms of what they're calling lingering ash, and we're at the edge of understanding that and protecting those trees and studying them. But I think there is some hope there. But as you say, the impact still will be devastating as it moves across the landscape.
Okay. A couple more questions here. I want to remind folks, if you do have a question, please direct your question to all participants. We only see them if you do that. The other ones that we have here, Bob, you mentioned that EAB changes from a 2-year life cycle to a 1-year cycle. Can you explain any more about why that happens, or any more about that?
Well, we picked emerald ash borer up in the Upper Peninsula, and it was just getting up there. We had it in some primarily green ash, but black ash, and at that time realized it was a 2-year life cycle. And so we think it's the cold, but we also think it's related to the stress in the tree. A healthy ash tree, for some reason, isn't as conducive to, I guess, feeding by and build up of the larvae. As once it starts succumbing, then it's more attractive in terms of oviposition, as well as the larvae seem to develop more quickly in it. I'm not exactly sure I understand that entirely, but I also think it's an issue of the colder, more northern climates. So you combine the two, we find that as you get northern Michigan, that a healthy resource and the cold, we end up having a 2-year life cycle. But it does seem to revert once populations start building and the trees become less vigorous. It seems to move and develop and feed more quickly.
Okay, got a couple of more questions coming in. First, what is your best recommendation for a replacement tree species for black ash in a seepage swamp?
I'm going to defer to Andrew or somebody else. We have really not done a lot of work on black ash, and I know that's your primary resource, and that's going to be the biggest question. Obviously, upland green and white ash have got a lot more options. I'm not sure if it's going to be some elm species, some tamarack species, things that grow well in lowland environments. That's going to be it's an issue we really haven't addressed. But they have a very good study out of the University of Minnesota. So.
I'm sorry, Bob. Next question is from Iowa. How similar do you expect Iowa's forests to respond to EAB, and what's happening in other states? Have Michigan folks been moving around the country to help consult with other states?
Oh yeah, we have annual conferences in Annapolis every year where we're updated. All the states are updated, all the attendees. We're putting Michigan State University in particular is putting a tremendous amount of educational material out, and all this research is being shared between the states and the federal forests. So we're trying to learn as quickly as we can.
I was wondering if you looked at the role of ownership and road density in the pace of spread.
The emerald ash borer we discovered pretty quickly moves along corridors. It likes edges. And along river corridors, emerald ash borer seems to move much more quickly. Travel corridors, edges, it likes edges. So if you say, so I'm not sure how that helps you too much, but when we started mapping the initial spread of this, it's amazing how it just seemed to follow these river corridors much more quickly into the resource. So I guess they're flight paths, or however you'd like to look at it. Most species like this, if you want to slow them down a bit, having a big block is with less edges advantage. But in this case, the higher amount of basal area you have, particularly larger trees, the quicker you're going to develop high populations that will be devastating. So I would say if you can harvest larger trees, leave smaller trees, and your population potential is smaller. But I'm not sure how much that's going to help you in the long run.
Bob, someone asked, I think, about what you were saying when I interrupted you. There was a question about the study you referenced about black ash. Who was the author? Which study was that?
Yeah, I wish I could remember. He's a silviculturalist out of University of Minnesota, and has got a several-year study. He's not there anymore, but maybe Andrew remembers his name. If you said it, I would know it. I want to say, I think it's an Italian name.
D'Amato.
D'Amato.
Yeah, I will, for those of you watching the chat pod, I will post a couple of links to that research. Yeah, Tony D'Amato, Brian Palick, Rob Slezak is a hydrologist or soils guy involved in that as well. So I'll share that again in a little bit. One more quick question, and then we're going to move on to our next speaker. From way up the North Shore, how old do the ash trees have to be before EAB will attack them? And is there a possibility that EAB will kill most host trees, but then die off for lack of host, and then we could bring along a new age class?
That'd be pretty great. Once a tree attains a diameter of 1 inch, EAB can successfully attack and breed in it and emerge. So there's not much hope. So the youngest as well as the oldest trees are quite susceptible. The disadvantage of the oldest trees, of course, being the population potential of these big old trees. They can produce just hundreds and thousands of EAB. But when you get as we get an ash will come back in very heavily as understory. Once they attain a size of 1 inch or 2, you're producing populations again. And there's lots of that. So emerald ash borer is a permanent part of our landscape, I hate to say.
All right, thank you, Bob, for a terrific presentation. We're going to now shift, and Andrew Arends will present for another 15-20 minutes, something like that. And at the end of Andrew's presentation, we will have an opportunity to ask questions of either of our speakers. So, Bob, we do have a couple more queued up that we'll have for you at least. So next, I want to welcome Andrew. Andrew is with the Minnesota DNR Division of Forestry. He'll be talking a little bit about the Minnesota perspective. Andrew, you're on.
Thank you. Just do a quick check. Can you hear me? Eli or Julie, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for the invitation to come and give you a perspective from Minnesota. Bob Hyde said there's not much hope. He left his presentation there. And here in Minnesota with our predominantly black ash cover type, what Michigan and Wisconsin have observed and managed will be helpful here in Minnesota, but we do kind of have a different ball of wax over here on this side of the Great Lakes. So again, my name is Andrew Arends. I work for the Minnesota DNR. I'm State Land Section Manager, and just wanted to share some information from our perspective here in Minnesota. Today I'll talk about the ash distribution across Minnesota, what we might expect once EAB gets up and rolling across the landscape, and then the DNR's early ash management plan. Until now, we have thought about and contemplated what the DNR will do on state lands. The DNR manages about 5 million acres, and here shortly we'll be rolling our ash management information into our larger landscape management plans that drive silviculture and timber sales and tree planting post-harvest. And we'll be rolling some of our information into those large plans and really starting to work in earnest to prepare for and respond to EAB coming here to Minnesota. I thought I would start just with some graphics on where black ash, green ash, and white ash occurs in the eastern half of the United States. We either are blessed or cursed. I think Minnesota and Maine have roughly about the same amount of black ash, and we lead the nation in the amount of that species. It has a lot of great characteristics used by American Indian tribes. It's found in the lowland areas where other things can't grow. It's a wonderful species, but it's going to be one that's going to be hard to replace. And so we're really going to struggle with that over time, as you probably are all aware. Green ash, much more widely found across the eastern half and even across the great northern plains. But here in Minnesota, second to black ash for sure. And then lastly, white ash you can see is predominantly in New England and down into the Ohio Valley up into Michigan, then Missouri on south. Just a smidge of white ash in Minnesota, so not really something that we're going to concern ourselves with too much there. So across Minnesota, ash, all species make up 8% of our forest resource by volume, but make up 25% of the forest resource by number of trees. Ash is found across 1.7 million acres. That's all ownership, federal, state, county, private, and tribal. We have roughly 18 million cords across those 1.7 million acres, and then another 0.7 million cords in the urban areas of our state. I'd spoken earlier about which ash species was most common. 69% of the ash in Minnesota is black ash, 30% is green ash, and then, like I said, just a smidgen of white ash out there. I think I heard Bob say they had just over 900 million trees, ash trees in Michigan. We're just a little ahead of them. We're just short of 1 billion trees in the rural areas, and then there are 3 million ash trees in urban areas. One of the early, one of the early sites here in St. Paul that was infested with EAB is called Witch's Hat Park. That's what I call it. I'm not sure what the official name is, but it's right along I-94 in St. Paul. It's a small park, maybe 5 to 8 acres in size. And when EAB was found in that park, they removed 600 ash trees out of just that small little park. And so when you start thinking about, I think at least my brain can't even comprehend 1 billion trees, but I can think about Witch's Hat Park having 600 ash trees just in that little park. And so it's really mind-numbing, the number of trees that are going to have to be dealt with or written off. Down below you can see some pictures pre and post EAB infestation from Ohio. Somebody had the forethought to take a picture down this boulevard, down this street before the infestation and then after, and really what a change that makes to an urban area, let alone across the rural parts of the state. A little bit about the state lands. Again, the Minnesota DNR administers 5 million acres. We have about 136,000 acres of ash cover type where the predominant species is ash. But ash is a component of many, many, many times more acres. And we feel somewhere around a third of the acreage that is ash is vulnerable to converting to non-forest cover post EAB infestation. And that's really concerning to those that are concerned about wildlife, water quality, the fiber production, name any of the goods that come off of a forested acre, and converting that to lowland shrubs, cattails. We just don't want to see that happen. So really, what do you do to prepare for that conversion? Well, that's what, first, just a map of Minnesota. You can see the little circles with a green splotch in the middle, and the purple squares show EAB infestation points. The red outline are quarantined areas. And you can see it's predominantly, EAB is found in the Twin City metro area and surrounding counties, and then down in the southeast along the border with Iowa and Wisconsin. And then don't forget, there's one little dot up there in Duluth. EAB has found its way across from Superior, Wisconsin, and found out on Minnesota Point in Duluth, Minnesota Point Park in Duluth, just a little strip of land that reaches out into Lake Superior, and it's found at the far end. So that's our first foray kind of into the northern portions of the state. But as you can see in the rest of northern Minnesota, if you go kind of run a line for those that aren't aware of the forest cover in Minnesota, if you run a line from Duluth over to Brainerd to Detroit Lakes and then up to Roseau, the northern third of the state. That's where the bulk of our forest cover is, and then also down in the southeast. The rest of Minnesota is, that ag forest mix, but predominantly our northern forests are where those black ash swamps and swales are, and where it's going to be most concerning for the state of Minnesota. The data on this slide was taken from a paper called Estimated Impacts of Emerald Ash Borer on Ash Timber Supply in Minnesota. It was a paper done by Curtis Vandershoff and Keith Jacobson with the Minnesota DNR a number of years ago. And they wanted to model kind of once the infestation got up and started moving across the state, what could we expect for mortality? If you were to do some harvesting, how much would you need to do to kind of keep up with it? And they also looked at the urban areas. So the first thing there is they figure mortality could reach as high as just shy of 2 million cords per year and 130,000 cords in the urban areas. That would kind of be a build-up and a peak. They looked at and modeled EAB infestation moving across the state, and if you were to do a liquidation, remove all the ash on a 25, 50, or 75 year time scale, what would be the harvest coming off the rural lands? And in a 25 year depletion rotation, annual harvest would peak just shy of 500,000 cords. Again, that's a peak. It'd lead up to reach that peak and then come back down. And then over 50 and 75 years, they found about the same amount. It's a little counterintuitive, 25 versus 75. You'd think if you stretch it out further, it'd be less. But we're talking, that's the peak. And they did count for ingrowth as well. And they didn't find much variation in the urban areas. They figure about 10,000 cords annually. So if you go to the web and type in the title of that paper, you can find that and give that a read. It's a good document and gives some good background. So what's the DNR going to do going forward? Up until now, we've been managing ash as we've always been managing ash, where we do some thinning, we do some final harvest. But we're limited somewhat by markets. We're also limited by accessing those black ash sites. So when I'm talking ash here, I'm talking mostly black ash with some green ash, but the majority of the ash that we harvest is black ash. And so we're going to focus where sites will not become too wet post-harvest. We want to focus there and convert those sites to other covers, maintain other covers. We're not going to walk away from those black ash swales for fear that we'll swamp them out. Swamping out, just a kind of a term we use where you'd lose the site to a water table rise that would impede other tree species from being planted or thriving. So we're not going to walk away from those sites that we're worried about swamping out because we want to try some things. Dr. Tony D'Amato and Brian Palick, as you'll see in the next slide, have worked on some sites and try and figure that out so that you don't swamp them out and lose them. So we'll be following their lead and then doing a few of our own things. I've already mentioned the DNR is going to work this new ash management techniques and guidance into our large land scale management plans where we set up our harvest schedules. So we'll be giving forestry staff specific acreage to go out and investigate for harvest and then come up with a development plan post-harvest. Is it planting? Is it leaving residual? Is it encouraging seeding from adjacent? We're still trying to figure that out. And then we're also looking at longer duration permits for black ash. As you know, black ash sites can be challenging to harvest. This past winter was a terrible harvest or a terrible winter for harvesting. We didn't have cold temperatures. Swamps did not freeze down as we had expected, and we had a limited harvest window. So instead of giving 2 or 3 years on a permit, we'll go 4 or 5 years to give the loggers a greater opportunity to get in there and harvest that black ash resource. This first bullet up there. You got lots of gobbledygook numbers and letters. I'll explain that. Don't worry too much. But really what we want to encourage our staff and the counties and private lands is we all need to make use of the best research and tools that we have. One of the best tools is our native plant community. We're going to focus on just a couple of communities. I've listed all the communities where black ash and green ash can be found. Underline the two, WFN 55 and WFN 64, where we feel like we have that's the greatest opportunities, and it's also the most common black ash cover types. And so those of you that use the ecological classification system, you'll recognize these nomenclature here and know that these kind of denote wet lowland forests, and so we're going to focus our efforts in those areas. We're also watching quite closely Dr. D'Amato's ash sites up on the Chippewa. He and Brian Palick, and I should have put Brian's name here as well. He's a co-researcher up there on the Chippewa north of Grand Rapids, Minnesota. They're looking at, they set up a couple of trials where they had clear cut of a black ash stand that just leave as is, and a group selection, and then they went in and killed all the black ash, girdled all the black ash, but left it standing. And they underplanted or planted in each of those different treatment types. I don't know, I think it's about 8 or 10 different tree species that seedlings they planted under each of those treatment types. And they're starting to find some winners and losers as far as seedling survival and growth. I'm not going to suggest that what they found are what you want to use, but the replacement species that seem to be doing very well are swamp white oak, American elm, Manchurian ash, and hackberry. My next slide will show kind of the native range of swamp white oak. The American elm that they used was Valley Forge. Manchurian ash is not native, and hackberry doesn't go as far north. But again, I'm not suggesting that you go out and start underplanting with these, but it's things that they found and that provide some good research for large landowners and small landowners to take a look at and see if that would fit into their management techniques they'd want to try. We're also watching the Sustainable Forestry Education Cooperative's Silvicultural Library. I see Wisconsin has a black ash silvicultural piece of information posted there, and learn from that. And then also listen to Wisconsin and Michigan and their observations over the years as they've struggled with EAB. Here's some information that I think we need to start to prepare stakeholders, partners, the public about what's coming our way once EAB gets up and running. The first bullet there, just harvesting on a scale that it would be deemed unsustainable. If you were to look from a forestry perspective, we're going to liquidate the ash and try and convert it and not lose sites. But that will be concerning to those that have forest certification, or neighboring communities will be concerned by this, but we need to start talking about this, I believe. We may be planting trees beyond their natural range. You can see swamp white oak and hackberry there, not found in northern Minnesota, but we may need to introduce. The black spruce and tamarack didn't seem to do very well in Dr. D'Amato and Palick's studies. But again, that's just one study site. We'll probably all try it, and over the years, we'll find a good solution, I hope. And then Manchurian ash and Valley Forge elm, we'll have to talk with Minnesota citizens, those that care about our forests, and are we willing to introduce new species into northern Minnesota? I don't know, but it's one of those conversations we'll probably need to have. We also need to find funding for ash management, both in the rural areas, so across the landscape, and then in the urban areas. In the last 2 legislative sessions, there have been bills introduced to get money for urban areas. And then policy and procedures may need to be altered to accommodate moving species north or into new areas, I should say, such as swamp white oak or hackberry, or even new species to the northwoods. And let me back up. Again, one of our forest health folks said, just remind people, we're not suggesting to do any of this just yet, but it's things that we need to think about as a forestry and as a resource group of folks. What do we want to do? In Michigan and Wisconsin, where it's a mixed forest, it's a little easier. You'll have remaining trees there, and you'll be able to kind of band-aid over it, and it won't be quite so stark as it will be here in Minnesota. And then the Minnesota Forest Resources Partnership, I came across this in a paper. They just had 5 very clear, easy to understand things to think about as you start to think about managing for EAB. Prioritize stands with an ash for immediate treatment, transition sites to non-ash species, reduce the concentration of ash, do not regenerate or reestablish ash, and protect the hydrologic functions of black ash sites to maintain tree cover. And this last slide here, you've got my contact information. Please feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email. And if you do harvest ash, maybe make some art in your yard as this person has, but don't move that ash. As you heard from Bob Hyde and the other experts, moving ash is a bad deal. Make some art in your yard, and that's what we'd suggest. So I'll open it up to questions.
Andrew, thank you. It was a very good presentation again. We have several questions that have come in the last few minutes, and first I want to comment on a couple of things in the chat pod. There was a question about yellow birch as a replacement species. Andrew, I'll give you a chance to respond to that if you would like in a moment, but I will point out that the research that you discussed a little bit by Brian Palak, Tony D'Amato, Rob Slezak, and others up on the Chippewa National Forest did investigate yellow birch as one of maybe 9 or 10 species. And I posted a link to a table from their research. The link is to the silviculture library that indicates, that includes data on survivorship of a number of species, and yellow birch was not one of the species that did well. Survival was under 10%, I believe, in all of the trials, all of the different treatments that you mentioned in which it was planted. So there is a bit more information there. Andrew, do you have anything further you want to add on yellow birch?
Yeah, we're all looking to Dr. D'Amato and Palak's research. It's really the first of its type working in those black ash swamps. And so what they found, I haven't asked them specifically, but they'd say that may be specific to that site. They did experience a very heavy rain. They had some more water than they expected. And so I think we all need to continue to try different species, but they're certainly blazing a path forward, giving us an idea what to expect. I know that Mark Jacobs in Aiken County has done a bit more ash management along with Mulpus Timberlands up in International Falls. And over the summer, DNR will be reaching out to a number of folks to capture more information, and we'll try and share that in some manner, either through the SFEC's website, or we'll get that out somehow.
Great, thanks, Andrew. You mentioned some utilization work, and I did post a link to the paper by Vanderschaff and Jacobson in the chat pod. We'll also share all of these links in our follow-up email. But a question came in, Andrew, about, where is it here? Someone said a logger had told him that black ash was no longer being cut into railroad ties because of EAB. I would assume maybe that's related to risks associated with moving that cut wood. The question goes on, I can understand the concern, but I think this is the opposite of what should happen. We have tons of harvestable ash, and any loss of a market outlet is a real negative situation. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I would agree. That'd be the wrong way to go. A couple of the larger paper mills will take ash and have indicated they're looking for more ash, so there's opportunity there. And then it would be good to know which logger and which tie producer, and maybe there's an opportunity for the DNR's utilization and marketing team, along with Forest Health and MDA, to reach out and encourage them to continue to use black ash for ties, as it's an important outlet to allow forest management to continue. So if that person wanted to shoot me an email, let me know where that was, we can certainly run that down for them.
Excuse me, next question is about financial support for landowners. Is there going to be, or is there now, any grant money available from the state, or if you know of any other sources, to support landowners who are struggling with planting costs from having to replant woodlots that are predominantly ash? A little later, this questioner points out he's asking about southeastern Minnesota, Wabasha, and Winona County.
Sure, I guess my first thing would be to get in contact with the DNR forester or a consulting forester. I don't know if there are SWCD foresters in the southeast. I don't believe so, but if there are, my apologies. But reach out to a forester. They can direct you to the USDA Service Center, and you can get signed up to access different cost share programs that would include replanting ash sites to other species. And the forester would also help you out with kind of the more holistic forest management plan for your property, and would weave in the cost share and help you prepare for or respond to EAB.
The next question came in a little bit ago, and the question might be one for Bob to address. It was about, Bob, whether you've seen any different effects in terms of resistance or mortality of ash based on landscape position. Bottomlands versus slopes versus higher up on the landscape. Bob, have we still got you?
Impacts on resistance. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, but we just heard the last couple words. Would you mind repeating that?
Yeah, of the things I've read, I have not seen any information on any landscape position or aspect impacts on EAB resistance. I think it's more individual or species specific.
All right, we've got a question here from Cloquet.
I just had a quick question. Is there any additional restrictions or guidelines as far as transporting ash to market?
That's for, you're on the Superior National Forest, so you're asking about northern Minnesota?
Yeah.
Great.
DNR.
Yeah, at this time, if you're on the Superior, there'd be no restrictions because you're not in one of the restricted counties.
A comment?
Go ahead.
In Michigan, you can move materials like railroad ties under compliance, but it have to be inspected. And the rule is on a tie is that you have to have at least, you can't leave bark, and bark is defined as not just the bark, but 1 inch of the sapwood. So it has to go at least an inch deep into the wood so that you're not risking moving any EAB life stages. So there is movement in Michigan under compliance, but it requires inspection and certain issues.
This is Andrew. I would add the same would happen here in Minnesota once the quarantines start to pop up in different areas. There are compliance agreements that can allow for movement, but there are clear treatment of cut products that need to occur, as Bob mentioned, cutting down into the wood beyond the bark.
Kind of an interesting, if maybe depressing question from St. Paul. Harvesting results in regrowth, but if trees are reinfested with EAB at about an inch in diameter, they're not going to produce new seed. So what is the viability of ash seeds? And before I hand off the floor here, I know that there's been some work to collect ash seed in anticipation of a real loss of genetic diversity as a result of the EAB infestation. Andrew David, who's in Grand Rapids and now at the Cloquet Forestry Center as well with the University of Minnesota, has been involved in that. Any other comments from either of our speakers?
This is
None.
Andrew. I would point to the same thing that you did, Eli.
All right, I think we're winding down here. I want to share one more comment, and I'll invite folks, if you have any closing thoughts or additional questions, please type them into the chat pod pretty quickly. Comment from up on the North Shore: we may need to spend more money during replacement species planting, as no native species are as well adapted to these sites as black ash. Spending more to retain a smaller component of various native species is not a good prospect, but it will be an important part of the process for establishing species diversity. Probably a good point. And one other comment, I guess, before I move on, from someone in southeast Minnesota. There is a market for ties from all ash species. We buy and produce them. So that ash, and that is in a part of the state in which EAB has been found. So maybe not all is lost there in terms of that particular market for ash. I want to thank our speakers one more time, Bob Hyde and Andrew Arends, for two excellent talks, for keeping their comments brief, for coming in right on time here. We covered a lot of ground, so thanks to both of you for working with us on that and for sharing your content today. It's been great. We will follow up with everyone who registered for this webinar. We'll send you an email within a week or so that will include links to all of the content that we mentioned in the chat pod and in the Q&A and so on. We will also include a link to the recording of this webinar in that same email, so you can expect that within a week. Any questions for Julie Hendrickson or me with the Sustainable Forest Education Cooperative? You should know how to reach us, I think. You'll hear from us in that email, if not before. And again, thanks for joining us. I do want to mention, I guess, one other thing quickly. Our next webinar is June 21st. We'll be hearing from Alexis Grindy. Alexis is the researcher up at UMD, and she will be talking about the importance of managed forests to Minnesota's forest birds. Again, that's Alexis Grindy on June 21st. Hope to see you then, and thanks again for joining us today. I'm signing off.